A mountain man bought the slave girl for $1, but what she did next made him burst into tears. It began on a dusty frontier street where a broken young woman was mocked and sold like cattle. The crowd jeered until one silent man stepped forward with a single coin. He thought he was just rescuing her. But in the shadows of his lonely cabin, she revealed a secret no one expected. She could read the Bible aloud with a voice that shook his soul. She could sing songs that made even hardened men weep. But when a powerful ranch foreman came to claim her back, the fight for her freedom turned into a battle for truth, faith, and justice. She wasn't who the town thought she was, and the papers that bound her were hiding a lie that could change everything. Now, in a world where law bends to greed and guns, one question echoes across the mountains. Can a single dollar and a single act of courage set her free, or will it cost them both everything? Your comments remind me that we're not alone in feeling deeply. If loyalty, second chances, and human dignity mean something to you, then you're right where you belong. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty square as Samuel Boone adjusted the stack of beaver pelts on his shoulder. The familiar scents of leather and tobacco hung in the air, mixing with the sharp tang of cattle from the nearby stockyards. His weathered boots crunched against the hard-packed dirt as he made his way toward the trading post. A crowd's jeering voices drew his attention to the auction block near the edge of the square. Samuel's steps slowed. Instead of the usual cattle or farm equipment, a young woman stood trembling on the wooden platform. Her dark hair hung in tangles around her face, and her simple dress was covered in trail dust. "What am I bid for this worthless slave girl?" the auctioneer bellowed, his voice carrying across the square. He grabbed the woman's arm roughly, making her stumble. "Half-breed, but she can cook and clean." Samuel's calloused hand tightened around the strap of his pelts. His jaw clenched as he watched the townsfolk laugh and call out cruel remarks. The woman kept her eyes downcast, but Samuel could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she tried to make herself smaller against the harsh words. $1, the auctioneer shouted when no bids came. "One measly dollar for this trash, or she goes to the work camp." He yanked her forward again, and this time she couldn't hold back a small cry of pain. The sound cut through Samuel like a knife. Without conscious thought, his feet carried him forward. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, slapping it down on the wooden block with enough force to make the coins already there jump. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone called out, "Boone's gone soft in the head." Another voice shouted, "What you want with a half-breed mountain man?" Samuel ignored them all. He stepped up to the platform and held out his hand to the young woman. She hesitated, her eyes meeting his for the first time. Despite her fear, there was something in those dark eyes that spoke of strength. "Come on," he said quietly. "You're safe now?" Her hand trembled as she placed it in his. Samuel helped her down from the block, steadying her when her legs wobbled. She was so thin, he could feel her bones through the thin fabric of her dress. "Ava Esperanza," she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. The words came out in a mix of Spanish and Apache that Samuel barely caught. He noticed the raw marks on her wrists where ropes had bitten deep. "Samuel Boone," he replied simply. He kept his hand under her elbow as he led her away from the auction block, his broad shoulders blocking her from the crowd's view. The sun was sinking toward the mountains as they reached the edge of town, where Samuel had left his mule. The animal's ears flicked forward at their approach, sensing something different in his master's manner. "Think you can ride?" Samuel asked, studying Ava's drawn face. She nodded, though her exhaustion was clear in every line of her body. Samuel helped her onto the mule's back, making sure she was steady before gathering the reins. The animal shifted, adjusting to the unfamiliar weight, but remained calm under Samuel's sure hand. Behind them, voices called out from the gathering dusk. "Hey, Boone, got yourself a bargain?" "$1 too much for that one." The cruel laughter echoed off the buildings, Samuel didn't turn around. He simply started walking, leading the mule toward the mountain trail that would take them to his cabin. As they left the town behind, the hostile voices faded, replaced by the evening chorus of crickets. Lanterns began to glow in windows, their light spilling out onto the dusty street in warm pools. Ava sat straight despite her weariness, her hands gripping the mule's coarse mane. She didn't speak, but Samuel could feel her watching him, trying to understand why this stranger had saved her. He didn't have an answer himself, except that something in him couldn't stand by and watch such cruelty. The crickets grew louder as they made their way into the gathering darkness, their steady chirping a peaceful contrast to the harsh voices they'd left behind. Samuel's mule plodded forward with careful steps, carrying its precious cargo toward the promise of safety in the mountains above. The mountain road twisted upward through the darkening forest, the mule's hooves finding sure footing on the familiar trail. Ava swayed in the saddle, her fingers wrapped tightly in the animal's coarse mane. The evening air grew cooler as they climbed, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and distant snow. Samuel walked steadily beside them, one hand never far from the mule's bridle. Every few minutes, his eyes would lift to check on Ava, watching for signs she might fall. The girl's face was drawn with exhaustion, but she held herself upright with quiet determination. The moon rose high overhead, casting silver light through the pine branches. Samuel could hear Ava's breathing growing more labored as fatigue took its toll. He stopped the mule beside a small stream, dipping his bandana in the cold water and offering it to her. She accepted with trembling hands, pressing the damp cloth to her cracked lips. "Not much further now," Samuel said softly, his gruff voice gentle in the night air. The trail narrowed as they continued upward, hemmed in by thick stands of pine and aspen. Near midnight, they finally emerged into a small clearing where Samuel's cabin stood dark and silent. The log walls gleamed faintly in the moonlight, smoke-blackened chimney rising against the star-filled sky. Samuel helped Ava down from the mule, steadying her when her legs buckled. He guided her to the cabin's wooden door while speaking low words of encouragement. Inside, he struck a match and lit a tin lantern, its warm glow filling the simple space. "Here," he said, filling a battered tin cup with water from a wooden bucket. "Drink slow." Ava's hands shook as she took the cup, but she managed small sips. When she finished, she sank down beside the cold fireplace, wrapping her arms around herself. Samuel quickly built up a fire, the flames catching and spreading welcome warmth through the cabin. While Ava dozed by the hearth, Samuel moved quietly around the cabin. He set coffee to brew in a blackened pot, its familiar aroma filling the air. Then he settled at his rough-hewn table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup. For the first time in years, words of prayer formed in his mind. They came hesitantly at first, then with growing urgency as he asked for guidance in helping this wounded soul who'd been placed in his care. Dawn arrived with a chorus of birdsong. Ava stirred, blinking in the early light that filtered through the cabin's single window. Samuel had already been up for hours, and now he set out a simple breakfast of cornbread and dried venison on a clean cloth. "Eat what you can," he said, pushing the food toward her. "No need to rush." Ava sat cross-legged by the table, her movements careful and measured. Though wariness remained in her dark eyes, gratitude showed in her small smile as she took tiny bites of the cornbread. She chewed slowly, savoring each morsel as if it were precious. After eating, she rose and began to explore the cabin. Her fingers trailed along the rough-hewn walls, taking in the sparse furnishings, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, a wooden rocking chair worn smooth by years of use. On a crude shelf, a leather-bound Bible sat alone, its pages edged with dust. Samuel headed outside to split wood, leaving the door open so he could keep an ear out for Ava. The steady rhythm of his axe filled the morning air. Thunk, crack, thunk, crack. Inside the cabin, Ava began to hum softly, an old tune that brought memories of her childhood floating back. The melody drifted out through the open door, weaving between the sounds of Samuel's work. As evening approached, Ava found an old broom in the corner. Despite her obvious fatigue, she began sweeping the packed dirt floor with careful strokes. Samuel stepped inside and started to protest, but Ava lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "Please," she said, her voice still rough but determined. "I want to help." A small smile touched her lips as she continued sweeping. Samuel watched her for a moment, noting how the simple act of working seemed to bring life back to her movements. He nodded slowly, understanding her need to feel useful, to reclaim some measure of control over her surroundings. "Much obliged," he said quietly, and returned to his tasks outside while Ava's soft humming resumed, filling the cabin with its gentle sound. Morning light streamed through the cabin's window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Samuel pulled on his worn leather boots and reached for his trapline bag. The creek would need checking. He had set fresh traps 2 days ago. "I will help," Ava said from her cot, already pushing herself up despite obvious fatigue. Samuel shook his head. "You need rest." But Ava was already standing, wrapping a threadbare shawl around her shoulders. Her dark eyes held determination. "Please. The air will do me good." Samuel considered arguing, but something in her steady gaze made him nod. They set out along the narrow trail, dew still clinging to the pine needles beneath their feet. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and wild mint from the meadows below. The creek burbled ahead, its voice growing stronger as they approached. Samuel checked his traps methodically, finding 2 rabbits and a beaver. He worked quickly, securing the pelts in his bag. When he turned, he found Ava watching intently, learning his movements. "I can carry those," she offered, reaching for the laden bag. "No need," Samuel said gruffly. "You don't owe me any work." Ava stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "I want to." Her words hung in the mountain air between them, weighted with meaning. Samuel studied her face for a long moment before slowly handing over the lighter of his 2 bags. They started back towards the cabin, moving at an easier pace. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the trail. Halfway home, Ava stumbled. Her legs, still weak from days of mistreatment, betrayed her. Samuel caught her arm before she could fall, steadying her against his solid frame. "Here now," he said gently, taking back the bag. "No shame in needing time to heal." Ava's cheeks flushed, but she nodded, accepting his support for the rest of the walk home. By the time they reached the cabin, Samuel could see the toll the morning's activity had taken. He helped her to the rocking chair while he set about preparing their evening meal. The rabbit meat sizzled in his iron pot, filling the cabin with savory aromas. Samuel added wild onions and the last of his dried carrots, watching the stew begin to simmer. Behind him, he heard soft footsteps and the whisper of pages. Ava had risen from her chair and retrieved the old Bible from its shelf. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light as she carefully opened the leather cover. Her fingers traced the letters with reverence before she began to read aloud. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she recited, her English clear and perfect. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Samuel turned from the stove, astonishment plain on his weathered face. The words flowed from her lips with practiced ease, her pronunciation refined and educated. She continued through the entire 23rd Psalm without hesitation. "You can read," he said, his voice rough with surprise. Ava closed the Bible carefully. "The sisters at Santa Maria Mission taught me. English, Spanish, and Latin, too." Her hands tightened on the book. "I was there 3 years before the raiders came." Samuel pulled a chair closer, the stew forgotten for the moment. Ava sank into the rocker, her shoulders tight with painful memories. "They killed the sisters," she whispered. "Took me and 2 other girls, sold us in Mexico." Her voice trembled. "I prayed every night for God to save me. Sometimes I thought he had forgotten." Samuel's throat tightened as he watched tears slip down her cheeks. This was no simple slave girl, but an educated young woman who had endured horrors he could barely imagine. Her faith, despite everything, humbled him. "I'll check the stew," he said gruffly, standing to hide his own emotion. They ate in companionable silence as darkness gathered outside. When Ava finally retired to her cot, Samuel stepped out onto the small porch. The night air carried the sweet scent of pine, and above him, stars crowded the vast mountain sky. He leaned against the rough-hewn post, his eyes tracking familiar constellations. The girl's words echoed in his mind, her quiet faith despite such suffering stirring something long dormant in his heart. "Maybe," he whispered to the starlit peaks. "You ain't forgotten me either." The mountains stood silent against the night sky, but for the first time in years, Samuel felt something like peace settle over his soul. A week passed like water flowing in the creek, steady and sure. Each day brought new strength to Ava's steps and more color to her cheeks. The mountain air worked its healing magic, while purpose returned to her movements. Samuel watched as she took to cabin life with quiet determination. Her clever fingers quickly learned to patch the holes in his worn shirts, stitches neat and even. She insisted on carrying water from the stream, though he made sure she never filled the bucket too full. In the cool mornings, she would grind cornmeal in the old stone mill, humming softly as she worked. The sound reminded Samuel of mourning doves at dawn, gentle yet persistent. Her songs drifted through the cabin, making the lonely place feel more like home than it had in years. "You need to learn this," Samuel said one morning, holding out his smaller axe. "For kindling, when I'm checking traps." Ava nodded, accepting the tool with reverence. He showed her how to stand, how to swing from the shoulder rather than the arms. She listened intently, dark eyes focused on every detail. Soon the sharp crack of splitting wood joined her hymns in the morning air. The 8th day dawned crisp and clear. Samuel sat on the cabin's front step, working his whetstone along the blade of his hunting knife. Ava was inside, the soft swish of her broom keeping time with her latest song. The sound of hoofbeats made them both freeze. A rider appeared through the trees, his horse's flanks lathered with sweat. The man sat tall in an expensive saddle, his clothes finer than most mountain folk could afford. His face wore authority like a mask, but his eyes were cold. "Boone," the rider called out, reining his horse to a stop. "I'm Carver Holt, foreman of the Bar H." Samuel stood slowly, knife still in hand. "What brings you up the mountain, Mr. Holt?" Holt's gaze slid past him to where Ava stood in the doorway. His lip curled. "That half-breed girl you bought, she belongs to the Bar H ranch." "She belongs to herself," Samuel said quietly. Holt pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Law says different." He shook the document open, showing official-looking seals and flowing signatures. "This here's a legal contract of indenture. That girl's ranch property until her debt's paid." Ava's sharp intake of breath carried across the yard. Samuel felt her hand grip his arm, trembling but determined to stand her ground. "That paper ain't worth the ink it's printed with," Samuel said, his voice flat as trail-worn leather. "She's free, and she's staying that way." Holt's face darkened. "You're interfering with ranch business, old man. That's dangerous thinking." He tucked the paper away with deliberate care. "I'll be back with deputies. They'll explain the law real clear-like." The foreman wheeled his horse, kicking up dust as he spurred away. Samuel and Ava watched until he disappeared among the pines. "He cannot take me," Ava whispered, but fear threaded through her words. Samuel turned to face her, his weathered hands gentle on her shoulders. "No, he can't," You're safe here, girl. I give you my word." She nodded, but her eyes stayed fixed on the trail where Holt had vanished. Samuel led her back inside, where the familiar walls of the cabin wrapped around them like a blanket. That evening, neither felt much like talking. Samuel stirred the cooking pot while Ava set their tin plates on the table. The fire popped and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. As they ate their simple meal, Ava began to hum. The tune was soft at first, barely louder than the fire's whisper. Samuel recognized it as Amazing Grace, a hymn his wife had loved. The melody grew stronger, and Ava's clear voice formed the words. "Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me." Samuel hadn't sung since Sarah died. The words felt rusty in his throat, but something in Ava's voice called to him. His deep bass joined her gentle soprano, uncertain at first, then growing more confident. "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." Their voices twined together in the firelit cabin, rising above fear and threat and loneliness. The harmony wrapped around them like a shield, a reminder that neither of them walked this path alone. Outside, darkness gathered in the mountains, but inside the cabin, two voices raised in song kept the shadows at bay. Dawn painted the mountains gold as Samuel hitched his mule to the wagon. The worn leather harness creaked as he tightened the straps, checking each buckle with care. They needed supplies, but more than that, they needed help against Holt's threats. Ava emerged from the cabin wearing her freshly mended dress, her dark hair neatly braided. She hesitated at the wagon's step, remembering her last time in town. "We'll manage just fine," Samuel said softly, offering his hand. She climbed up beside him, fingers tight on the wooden seat. The wagon rolled down the mountain trail, wheels clattering over rocks and roots. Pine branches swayed overhead, their shadows dancing across the path. The town square came into view just as the church bell struck 9. Ava's shoulders tensed as they passed the auction block where Samuel had found her. He clicked to the mule, hurrying past. Outside the mercantile, Samuel helped Ava down. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans and leather. Whispers followed them between the shelves. Samuel kept his body between Ava and the curious stares as they gathered flour, coffee, and seeds. "That mountain man and his Indian girl," someone muttered. "Heard tell she belongs to the Bar H," another voice added. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice gentle when speaking to Ava. "What seeds would you like for your garden?" She chose carefully, tomatoes, beans, and marigolds. Her fingers traced the paper packets as if touching hope itself. The church stood at the edge of town, its white boards gleaming in the morning sun. Reverend Markham met them at the door, his kind face creased with concern as they shared their story. "Holt's contract is surely forged," the preacher said, studying Ava's face. "But I must warn you, frontier justice often follows the dollar rather than the law." He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Still, remember this. God's law stands above man's greed. Your worth comes from him, not from any paper Holt waves about." Ava's eyes filled with tears. "May I?" she asked softly, gesturing to the small organ in the corner. "Of course, child." Her fingers found the keys, and a Spanish hymn filled the church. The melody spoke of mercy and deliverance, rising to the rafters like a prayer. Samuel found himself blinking hard, remembering how Sarah had loved church music. "She has a gift," Reverend Markham said quietly, "and gifts like that don't come from property. They come from the soul." As afternoon shadows lengthened, they left town for Henry's cabin. The Ute Scout lived in a clearing where forest met meadow, his home a blend of native and settler ways. He greeted them with dignified warmth, smoking a pipe on his porch. "The Bar H has no honor," Henry said after hearing their tale. His dark eyes held ancient wisdom. "They steal land with paper, just as they would steal this young one's freedom. He touched his chest. "I will stand witness. My word still carries weight with some." That night, Henry shared his table and hearth. Ava helped his wife prepare dinner, their hands working together over cornbread and stew. Samuel noticed how the women needed no common language to understand each other's smiles. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Samuel and Ava bid farewell to their hosts, Henry's promise of support warming them like the rising sun. The wagon rolled homeward through forests painted with morning light. They reached Samuel's cabin as afternoon faded toward evening. While Samuel unhitched the mule, Ava knelt by the porch with her precious seed packets. Her fingers worked the soil, dark earth crumbling between them. "The ground is good here," she said, looking up at Samuel. "Things will grow." He watched her plant each seed with reverent care. Tomatoes for food, beans to enrich the soil, marigolds for beauty. Her movements were sure, as if each seed represented a small defiance against those who would deny her humanity. The setting sun gilded her face as she worked, her song rising soft and clear in the mountain air. Samuel recognized it as the same hymn she had played in the church. Here, among the pines and wildflowers, it sounded like freedom itself. Spring melted into summer on the mountain, bringing new rhythms to the cabin. Each morning, Ava tended her garden, her gentle hands coaxing life from the dark soil. Tender green shoots pushed through the earth, tomatoes reaching for the sun, bean vines curling around stakes, and marigolds dotting the edges with gold. Samuel watched her work, marveling at how she spoke softly to the plants in 3 languages. Sometimes she sang, her voice carrying across the clearing like morning mist. The garden flourished under her care, just as she herself grew stronger each day. "You need to learn mountain ways too," Samuel told her one morning, holding up a pair of wooden snowshoes. "Winter comes early up here." Ava traced the woven webbing with curious fingers. "Show me." They practiced in the meadow, Ava laughing as she stumbled through her first steps. Samuel steadied her with a patient hand, remembering how Sarah had taught him years ago. By afternoon, Ava moved with growing confidence, following deer tracks through the grass. "Next, you learn to split logs," Samuel said, leading her to the chopping block. He demonstrated the proper stance, showing her how to let the axe's weight do the work. Ava's first attempts barely scratched the wood, but she persisted. Within days, the satisfying crack of split logs joined the garden songs in their daily routine. During quiet evenings, they shared stories over coffee. Samuel spoke of Sarah, how they had built the cabin together, her love of wildflowers, the fever that took her too soon. His voice grew rough with memory, but the words came easier each time. Ava told him about her mother's songs, passed down through generations of Apache women. "Each song holds a story," she explained, "about rain, mountains, freedom." She described the mission school where she had learned to read, write, and play organ before the raiders came. Samuel listened, his heart aching at the injustice, yet proud of her resilience. Laughter began to echo in the cabin's corners. They found humor in small things: a rabbit stealing bean sprouts, Samuel's failed attempts at tortillas, Ava's first time trying to milk their old goat. The sound seemed to chase away old shadows. One afternoon, a rider brought news of a gathering at the schoolhouse. "Just neighbors sharing supper and music," the man said. "Reverend Markham asked special to invite you both." Samuel frowned, but Ava touched his arm. "Perhaps we should go," she said softly. "We cannot hide forever." The schoolhouse glowed with lamplight as they arrived. Inside, families shared dishes of cornbread and stew. A fiddler played in the corner while children danced. Some faces turned cold at their entrance, but Reverend Markham welcomed them warmly. After supper, while the fiddler rested, someone called for Ava to sing. She hesitated, looking at Samuel. He nodded encouragement, though his hands clenched with worry. Ava stood slowly, smoothing her dress. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to sing. The song rose in Apache words, telling of eagles soaring free, of wind dancing through canyon walls, of mothers singing their children to sleep beneath star-filled skies. Though few understood the words, the melody carried freedom's yearning in every note. The room fell silent. Children stopped playing. The fiddler's bow hung motionless. Ava's voice filled every corner with ancient longing and present hope, weaving together her mother's heritage and her own dreams of freedom. Samuel felt tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. The song reached deep into his soul, touching grief and joy alike. He saw Sarah in his mind, remembered her own love of music. But more than that, he saw Ava, no longer the trembling girl from the auction block, but a woman standing tall in her own power. When the last note faded, silence held for a heartbeat. Then applause erupted, genuine and warm. Ava opened her eyes, surprised by the response. Even those who had turned cold faces earlier nodded with respect. They rode home by lantern light, the moon rising over pine-dark mountains. The mules' hooves clicked steadily on the trail, while crickets sang in the grass. "Ava," Samuel said quietly, "what you have, that voice, that spirit, no man can take it from you. No paper, no rancher, no law, but God's can touch what's in your soul." She turned to him, and for the first time since he had known her, she smiled fully. Not the cautious half-smiles of before, but a real, joyful expression that transformed her face. "I know," she replied softly. "You helped me remember that." The lantern swung gently as they rode on, its light catching the tears still drying on Samuel's cheeks. Above them, stars wheeled in the vast mountain sky, witnesses to the quiet miracle of healing hearts. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft gold as Samuel shouldered his rifle and pack. The morning air held summer's warmth, sweet with pine and wild sage. He paused at the cabin door, watching Ava kneel by her flourishing garden. "Mind those tomatoes while I check the creek traps," he called. "Might be ready soon." Ava looked up from her work, soil darkening her fingers. "I will sing to them," she said with a gentle smile. "They grow better with songs." Samuel shook his head, smiling at her ways. As he started down the trail, her clear voice followed him, weaving Spanish and Apache words into a melody about rain and growing things. He had not gone far when the sound of approaching horses echoed through the trees. Samuel froze, listening. Too many hooves, moving too fast for friendly visitors. His heart clenched as he turned back toward the cabin. The peaceful morning shattered as 3 riders burst into the clearing. Carver Holt sat proud on his bay stallion, a cruel smile twisting his face. Behind him, 2 deputies wearing tin stars drew their horses to a halt, dust rising around their boots. "Got papers here from Judge Wilson himself," Holt announced, waving a document. "Says this Apache girl's the property of Bar H Ranch, and we're taking her back where she belongs." Samuel dropped his pack, stepping between them and Ava. "She belongs to no man," he growled. "That paper's worth less than dirt." "Reckon you're wrong there, mountain man." One deputy dismounted, iron shackles jangling at his belt. "Law's the law." "She's free," Samuel insisted. "I paid fair at auction." The second deputy's rifle butt cracked against Samuel's temple before he could finish. Stars exploded in his vision as he crashed to the ground. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Ava scream, "No, please!" Her voice broke with terror as the deputies seized her arms. The sound of chains clicking closed made Samuel's stomach turn. He tried to push himself up, blood trickling down his face. His world spun sickeningly as he watched them drag Ava toward the horses. She twisted in their grip, looking back at him with eyes that held both fear and desperate trust. "Samuel!" she cried out as Holt grabbed her roughly, hauling her onto his horse. "She's free!" Samuel shouted hoarsely, struggling to his knees. "You got no right." "Rights are for white folks," Holt sneered. He wrapped a fist in Ava's long hair, jerking her head back. "This one's going where half-breeds belong." Samuel lunged forward, but his legs betrayed him. He collapsed again as the riders wheeled their horses around. Ava's terrified face burned into his memory as they galloped away, the sound of hooves and chains fading into the forest. For long minutes, Samuel lay in the dirt, willing the world to stop spinning. When he finally managed to stand, the clearing felt hollow. The garden Ava had tended lay trampled. Her half-finished song hung broken in the air. Evening crept in, bringing shadows that seemed darker than before. Samuel sat alone in the cabin, the silence pressing against him like a physical weight. No humming, no soft footsteps, no gentle voice reading scripture, just the crack and hiss of the hearth fire. His fingers found the old Bible on the shelf, the one Ava had read from that first night, revealing her education and her faith. Samuel sank to his knees beside the fire, clutching the worn leather binding to his chest. "Lord," he whispered, voice rough with pain and fury, "I ain't asked much of you since Sarah died. Maybe I lost my way, but that girl—" His throat tightened. "She never lost faith, even after everything. She kept singing your praises." Tears fell onto the Bible's cover as Samuel bowed his head. "Please," he begged, "give me strength to fight for her. Show me the way. Don't let them break her spirit. Don't let them chain her soul." The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, a lone coyote called into the gathering night. Samuel remained on his knees, praying with a desperate intensity he had not felt in years, asking God to protect the young woman who had brought light back into his dark cabin. "I'll find a way," he promised both heaven and himself. "Whatever it takes, I'll bring her home." Dawn had barely touched the mountain peaks when Samuel stepped out of his cabin. His head throbbed where the rifle butt had struck, and dried blood still crusted his temple. Each movement sent daggers of pain through his skull, but he could not wait. Would not wait. He secured the cabin door with trembling fingers. The trampled garden caught his eye, Ava's sanctuary destroyed by uncaring boots. Anger steadied his hands as he mounted his mule, though the effort left him dizzy. The ride into town seemed longer than ever before. His mule picked its way carefully down the mountain trail, while Samuel fought to stay upright in the saddle. By the time the church spire came into view, sweat soaked his shirt despite the morning chill. Reverend Markham stood on the church steps, his usual warm smile replaced by grave concern. "Samuel," he called, hurrying forward. "Henry rode through late last night. Told me what happened." He caught Samuel as he half fell from the saddle. "Come inside, brother. You need tending." The church's cool interior provided blessed relief. Markham eased Samuel onto a wooden pew, then disappeared into his study. He returned with clean cloths and a bottle of witch hazel. "Hold still," the Reverend instructed, beginning to clean the wound. "This will sting something fierce." Samuel barely flinched. Physical pain seemed distant compared to the ache in his chest. "They took her," he said hoarsely. "Just rode in and took her, like she was property." "The Lord sees," Markham replied, his gentle hands belying the steel in his voice. "And he will not stand for such evil." He pressed a fresh bandage to Samuel's temple. "Henry's waiting at my house. Says he might know something that could help." They found the Ute Scout in Markham's small parlor, standing straight and still by the window. He turned as they entered, his dark eyes taking in Samuel's condition. "My friend," Henry said quietly, "my heart is heavy for your loss." He gestured for Samuel to sit. "But I bring hope. The girl, Ava. I have seen her before, many seasons ago." Samuel leaned forward despite his dizziness. "Where?" "At Sacred Heart Mission, south of here. 3 days' ride across the grasslands." Henry's voice carried absolute certainty. "She was there with other children, learning from the sisters, before the raiders came." "Raiders?" Markham asked. Henry nodded grimly. Bad men who steal children to sell. But the mission, they keep records of all their students, names, families, dates. If we find those records, we can prove she was free, Samuel finished, his hands clenched into fists. Prove Holt's papers are lies. Markham touched Samuel's shoulder. You are in no condition to ride. Does not matter. Samuel pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. Every hour we wait is another hour she suffers. The Reverend studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well, but take provisions from my stores. And Samuel... His face grew stern. Carver Holt and his kind, they do not give up what they see as property without a fight. Be careful. Henry helped Samuel gather supplies, while Markham wrote out a letter of introduction to the mission's Mother Superior. They loaded Samuel's mule with food, water, and blankets as the sun climbed higher. I will pray for your safe return, Henry said as Samuel prepared to mount, and for the girl's spirit to stay strong. Samuel gripped the scout's hand. Thank you, friend, for everything. The town fell away behind him as Samuel guided his mule south. Each hoofbeat sent spikes of pain through his head, but he pushed onward. The mountain trail gradually gave way to rolling foothills, then opened onto vast plains stretching towards the horizon. When darkness fell, Samuel made a small camp beneath a stand of cottonwoods. The stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant. He thought of Ava, wondered if she could see the same stars through whatever window they had locked her behind. I'm coming, he whispered into the night. Hold on, child. I won't let them keep you in chains. His voice broke on the last word. Sleep came in fitful bursts, haunted by dreams of Ava's terrified eyes as they dragged her away. He woke before first light, chest tight with renewed purpose. As he saddled his mule, the rising sun painted the eastern sky in shades of hope. The second day's journey took him deeper into the plains. Patches of pine gave way to endless grass, rippling like a green ocean in the warm wind. By afternoon, he caught his first glimpse of Sacred Heart Mission. A cluster of whitewashed buildings crowned by a modest steeple. Samuel paused on a low rise, studying the peaceful scene below. Somewhere in those buildings lay the proof he needed. Proof that could free Ava from Holt's grasp. His body ached, his head still throbbed, but his spirit had never felt stronger. Almost there, he murmured, patting his mule's neck. Almost there. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mission courtyard as Samuel drew his mule to a halt. His body ached from 3 days of hard riding, but hope stirred in his chest at the sight before him. The adobe walls of Sacred Heart Mission stood weathered yet dignified, their simple lines speaking of peace and purpose. Children's laughter rang from a nearby garden where students tended neat rows of vegetables. A bell tolled softly from the modest church tower, its clear notes carrying across the quiet grounds. Samuel dismounted carefully, his injuries still making every movement a study in patience. He had barely secured his mule to a hitching post when the mission's heavy wooden door swung open. "Welcome, traveler," called a gentle voice. A priest emerged, his black cassock dusty at the hem from walking the mission's earthen paths. His face was deeply lined, but his eyes sparkled with warmth. "I am Father Mateo. You seem to have journeyed far." Samuel removed his hat, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. "Samuel Boone, Father?" "From Silver Bluff territory." He drew the letter from his coat. "Reverend Markham sends his regards." Father Mateo's weathered hands unfolded the paper carefully. As he read, his expression grew serious. "Come inside, Senor Boone. We should speak privately." The mission's interior offered blessed coolness after days under the prairie sun. Father Mateo led Samuel to a small study lined with books and papers. A crucifix hung on the whitewashed wall, and afternoon light streamed through narrow windows. "Tell me about this girl," Father Mateo said, settling behind his desk. Samuel's voice grew rough as he described finding Ava at auction, her gentle strength, and Holt's cruel deception. Henry, our Ute friend, remembered her here. Said you might have records. Father Mateo nodded slowly. See, we keep careful accounts of all our students. He rose and crossed to a tall cabinet. Many of our children come from mixed heritage. Documentation can mean the difference between freedom and bondage. The priest began pulling leather-bound ledgers from the shelves, muttering dates under his breath. Samuel watched, barely breathing, as Father Mateo paged through book after book. Ah! The exclamation made Samuel start. Here. Father Mateo's finger traced down a neat column of names. Ava Esperanza, enrolled in the year 1862. Mother's Christian name, Maria Esperanza. Father unknown but believed Apache. He looked up at Samuel. She was an excellent student, particularly gifted in music and scripture. Samuel's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the desk. The record, it proves she was never property? Indeed. Father Mateo carefully removed the page from its binding. This shows she entered our school as a free person, remained here 3 years until raiders attacked. His voice hardened. Men who profit from stealing children and selling them into false contracts. Relief flooded through Samuel's tired body. Here was the proof they needed. Proof that could break Holt's fraudulent claim. Father Mateo wrapped the precious document carefully in oilcloth. You must rest before your journey back, the priest said firmly. No arguments, my friend. I can see you are injured and exhausted. Samuel tried to protest, but his legs betrayed him, buckling as he stood. Father Mateo called for Brother Thomas, who helped guide Samuel to the mission's simple guest quarters. That evening, Samuel joined the priests for a quiet supper of bread, cheese, and fresh vegetables from the garden. The simple food tasted like a feast after days of trail rations. As they ate, Father Mateo spoke of justice and mercy. Remember, my son, the old priest said, breaking bread. True justice requires not only courage but humility. We must stand firm against evil while keeping our own hearts soft before God. Samuel nodded, thinking of Ava's gentle strength. She taught me that, Father. Showed me how to be strong without becoming hard. Night settled over the mission like a prayer. Samuel lay on a narrow cot, listening to crickets through the open window. For the first time since Ava's capture, he slept deeply and without dreams. Morning came with the sound of the mission bell calling students to breakfast. Samuel rose, his body still sore, but his spirit renewed. Father Mateo met him in the courtyard as he prepared his mule for the return journey. The ledger is secure? Samuel asked, checking his saddlebags. See, wrapped safely in oilcloth. Father Mateo pressed a small package of food into Samuel's hands. For your journey. Then the priest raised his arms in blessing. May God guide your path and protect both you and the child. Samuel bowed his head, accepting the blessing with quiet gratitude. As he mounted his mule, Father Mateo's words followed him. Go with courage and grace, my friend. Justice will prevail. The mission grew small behind him as Samuel turned north. The precious ledger rode secure against his chest, each hoofbeat carrying him closer to confrontation with Holt and his corrupt judge. But now he carried more than proof. He carried hope, wrapped as carefully as the oilcloth package that would win Ava's freedom. The setting sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and purple as Samuel guided his mule along the mountain trail. 2 days of hard riding had brought him within striking distance of Silver Bluff, but something wasn't right. The birds had gone quiet, and the hair on the back of his neck prickled with warning. He reined his mount to a stop, listening intently. There, the soft clink of metal against metal, perhaps a spur or bit, drifted up from the switchback below. Samuel's hand moved to the ledger secured inside his coat. After 15 years in these mountains, He knew every fold of the land, every hidden draw and rocky shelter. Holt's men might know ranching, but they didn't know these heights. The sound of hooves grew clearer. Samuel spotted movement through the trees. 3 riders, their horses' flanks bearing the Bar H brand. They were tracking him, no doubt hoping to intercept the proof of Ava's freedom before he could reach town. Samuel turned his mule onto a narrow deer trail, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The path wound up through a maze of granite outcrops toward a deep ravine. Behind him, voices carried on the evening air. "There! Tracks heading up. Don't lose him. Boss wants that paper." Samuel allowed himself a grim smile. The ravine ahead was a natural trap, its steep walls funneling toward what appeared to be an easy pass. But he knew better. The real trail, invisible from below, branched off through a screen of scrub pine. Shadows lengthened as Samuel led his pursuers deeper into the trap. The mule's hooves clattered on loose stone, marking his path clearly, too clearly. At the junction, Samuel dismounted and led his mule through the concealing pines. Behind him, the ranch hands' voices echoed off the ravine walls. "He's boxed in now. We'll have him at the pass." Settling his mule in a protected hollow, Samuel worked his way back to watch. The 3 riders pushed their horses hard, racing for the false pass ahead. As darkness gathered, their curses carried back when they found the trail ended in a blank wall of rock. Samuel waited until full dark before moving. The quarter moon provided just enough light to pick his way down the secret trail, leading his mule on a long rope. By midnight, he had circled behind his pursuers and regained the main track to Silver Bluff. He rode through the rest of the night, the precious ledger secure against his chest. His body ached from days in the saddle, but determination drove him forward. Ava's freedom waited in these pages. He would not fail her. Dawn's first light revealed the church steeple of Silver Bluff rising above the plain. Samuel's mule stumbled with exhaustion as they approached Reverend Markham's modest parsonage. The preacher himself emerged at the sound of hooves in his yard. "Samuel, thank the Lord!" Markham hurried forward to help the weary rider dismount. "We've been praying for your safe return. Come inside, quickly." In the parsonage's small study, Samuel drew out the oilcloth-wrapped ledger with trembling hands. His voice was rough from trail dust as he described his journey. The mission, Father Mateo's help, and the pursuit through the mountains. Reverend Markham carefully unwrapped the precious document. His eyes brightened as he read the clear proof of Ava's status as a free woman and former student. "This is exactly what we needed," the preacher said, his voice thick with emotion. "A legal record, properly witnessed and dated, showing she was never anyone's property." He looked up at Samuel. "With this, we can force a public hearing. Judge Whitcomb won't be able to ignore such clear evidence, no matter how much Holt has paid him." Samuel sank into a chair, exhaustion finally overtaking him. "How soon?" "I'll file the petition today," Markham said firmly. "We'll demand an immediate hearing, citing unlawful imprisonment." He gripped Samuel's shoulder. "Rest now, my friend. You've done more than we dared hope." As Samuel's eyes closed, his thoughts turned to Ava. He pictured her locked in some ranch outbuilding, surrounded by hostile men. But he knew her spirit remained unbroken. He remembered her quiet strength, her dignity even in chains. She had taught him about courage wrapped in gentleness. Miles away at the Bar H ranch, Ava huddled on a thin blanket in a converted tack room. Through a high window, she could see stars wheeling across the night sky. The same stars, she thought, that watched over Samuel's cabin, over the mission where she had known happiness, over all who longed for freedom. She pressed her hands together in prayer, remembering Samuel's words that final morning. "No paper, no chains can take away who you truly are." His voice had held such conviction, such certainty. Ava held those words close, letting them warm her through the cold hours until dawn. Soon, though she didn't know it yet, Samuel's return would set in motion events that would test them all. But for now, she simply prayed, her soft voice joining the night wind that swept down from Samuel's beloved mountains. Word spread through Silver Bluff like wildfire on a dry plain. Every porch, every saloon, and every church pew buzzed with talk of the upcoming hearing. Samuel Boone, the quiet mountain man, was challenging the mighty Bar H Ranch in open court. "Man's touched in the head," old Jim at the Mercantile declared, shaking his head. "Going up against Holt and his money? Might as well try wrestling a grizzly." But others, watching Samuel's tall figure stride purposefully through town with Reverend Markham, saw something different. They recognized the quiet strength of a man standing for what was right, no matter the cost. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and crisp. Townsfolk gathered early outside the courthouse, a weathered two-story building that doubled as the town hall. Samuel arrived flanked by Reverend Markham and Henry, the Ute Scout. The mountain man's face was etched with determination, though his hands trembled slightly as he clutched the precious ledger. Inside, the courtroom smelled of dust and pine wood polish. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching motes in its beam. The wooden benches creaked as people filed in, filling every available space. Judge Whitcomb sat behind his elevated desk, his jowly face set in a perpetual frown as he surveyed the crowd. The side door opened, and two deputies led Ava in. Samuel's heart clenched at the sight of iron shackles on her delicate wrists. She looked thinner, her face drawn with weariness, but her head was held high. When her eyes met Samuel's across the room, a flash of hope lit her features. Carver Holt lounged in a chair near the front, a satisfied smirk playing at his lips. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man in an expensive suit, shuffled papers importantly on the table before them. "Court is now in session," Judge Whitcomb announced, his gavel crack echoing through the packed room. "Matter of Bar H Ranch versus Samuel Boone regarding custody of one female laborer." Samuel rose slowly, the ledger clutched to his chest. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "I present evidence that Ava Esperanza is a free woman, wrongfully held in bondage." He stepped forward, laying the mission ledger on the judge's desk. "I also submit written testimony from Father Mateo of St. Anthony's Mission," Samuel continued, producing a sealed envelope. "It confirms Ava's status as a former student, educated in both scripture and letters." Judge Whitcomb's frown deepened as he examined the documents. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the morning cool. He was well aware of the packed courtroom, watching his every move. Reverend Markham stepped forward next, his voice ringing with righteous conviction. "Your Honor, there is a law higher than any man's contract. God's law declares all his children free. To hold this educated Christian woman in chains mocks both divine and natural justice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I would speak," Ava said suddenly, her clear voice cutting through the whispers. All eyes turned to her as she stood, chains clinking softly. "I will not be silenced," she declared in perfect English. Then, switching to Apache, she spoke words of dignity and determination that needed no translation. The courthouse fell absolutely still. Holt's lawyer jumped to his feet. "Objection! This person has no standing to address the court." "I have every standing," Ava responded firmly. "I am a free woman who was taught at a Christian mission. I read, I write. I know both God's law and man's law, and neither permits what has been done to me." The crowd stirred uneasily. Many had never heard a native woman speak with such eloquence and authority. They looked at her with new eyes, seeing not a slave girl, but a person of substance and grace. Holt's lawyer sputtered, rifling through his papers, but the evidence was undeniable. The mission ledger showed clear dates and signatures. Father Mateo's testimony was properly witnessed and sealed. Judge Whitcomb mopped his brow with a handkerchief. He could feel the weight of the community's gaze, sense the shifting tide of opinion. Even his usual allies were watching him with uncertainty. "Having reviewed the evidence," he announced finally, his voice strained, "this court finds the alleged contract of indenture to be void and without merit." He paused, then added quickly, "The defendant, Ava Esperanza, is hereby declared free from all claims of servitude." A deputy stepped forward with a key. The shackles fell away from Ava's wrists with a dull clank against the wooden floor. She rubbed the reddened skin where iron had bit into flesh, tears gathering in her eyes. Samuel moved to her side, supporting her as she swayed slightly. Around them, the courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and muttered conversations. Holt stormed out, his face dark with rage, but few noticed his departure. "Thank you," Ava whispered to Samuel, her voice thick with emotion, "for believing in me, for fighting for me." Outside the courthouse, the late morning sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's dusty main street. A crowd had gathered, their voices a mix of whispers and murmurs that rippled through the air like wind through prairie grass. Samuel stood protectively beside Ava as they descended the courthouse steps, his weathered hand steady at her elbow. Some townsfolk stepped forward, offering hesitant smiles and quiet congratulations. Mrs. Peterson, the baker's wife, pressed Ava's hand warmly. "God bless you, child," she whispered, her eyes showing hints of shame for not speaking up sooner. Others hung back, averting their gazes or studying their boot tips. They'd watched Ava's humiliation at auction, had stayed silent during her suffering, and now couldn't meet her steady gaze. Carver Holt burst through the courthouse doors behind them, his face flushed crimson with rage. His boots thundered down the wooden steps as he shoved past onlookers. "This ain't over, Boone!" he snarled, spittle flying from his lips. "You'll regret crossing the Barha!" He stormed toward his horse, cursing violently enough to make several women gasp and cover their ears. Samuel moved to shield Ava, but she touched his arm gently. Standing tall, chin lifted high, she watched Holt's retreat with quiet dignity. The sight of her calm strength made several townsfolk straighten their own shoulders, as if her courage was catching. "Come," Reverend Markham said, approaching them with a warm smile. "Sarah has been cooking all afternoon. You'll both sup with us tonight, and Henry too." He nodded toward the Ute scout, who stood quietly observing the scene from the shade of a nearby oak. The Reverend's parsonage sat just behind the white-painted church, a modest home brightened by Sarah Markham's flourishing flower garden. Inside, the aroma of beef stew and fresh-baked bread filled the cozy rooms. Golden lamplight cast a warm glow over the gathering as they settled around the well-worn dining table. Sarah ladled generous portions of stew into earthenware bowls, while Henry helped pass around a basket of steaming bread. For a few moments, there was only the comfortable sound of spoons against bowls and appreciative murmurs. "I nearly lost my way during all this," Samuel admitted softly, breaking the peaceful silence. He stared into his bowl, his voice rough with emotion. "When they took you, Ava, when I was beaten and couldn't stop them, I feared God had abandoned us both." Ava reached across the table, laying her small hand over his large, calloused one. "He carried us both," she whispered, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. "Through the mission school, through my captivity, through your rescue. Even in the darkest moments at the ranch, I felt his presence." Henry raised his tin cup, his usually stoic face creased in a rare smile. "To family found, not bought," he declared in his deep voice. "To bonds stronger than any paper or chain." Laughter rippled around the table, releasing weeks of tension. Even Samuel chuckled, the sound rusty but genuine. Reverend Markham led them in a prayer of thanksgiving, his words painting pictures of divine justice and mercy that had them all nodding in agreement. The evening passed sweetly, filled with good food and better company. As the last rays of sunset painted the western sky in shades of purple and gold, Samuel and Ava prepared to return to the mountain cabin. Sarah packed them a basket of leftover bread and her best strawberry preserves, while Reverend Markham pressed a small package of coffee into Samuel's hands. The ride home was peaceful, broken only by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the evening song of crickets. When they reached the cabin, Samuel lit the lamp while Ava stirred the banked fire back to life. The familiar space welcomed them, somehow warmer and more like home than ever before. Samuel carefully unwrapped the mission ledger from its oilcloth covering. With reverent hands, he hung it on the wall beside the old family Bible. The two books side by side seemed right somehow, one recording God's eternal truth, the other preserving proof of Ava's dignity and freedom. "There," he said softly, stepping back to study the arrangement. "A testimony that can't be erased or forgotten." Ava stood beside him, her eyes shining in the lamplight as she gazed at the documents that had helped secure her liberty. The ledger's pages held more than just ink and paper. They contained the truth of who she was, a free woman of education and faith, never to be bound again. The days following the courthouse victory brought gentle changes to the mountain cabin. Morning fog rolled away to reveal Ava kneeling in her garden patch, carefully pressing bean and squash seeds into the dark soil. She hummed softly while working, her fingers moving with practiced care. The earth seemed to welcome her touch, as if sensing her own renewal. Samuel spent his mornings on the cabin roof, replacing worn shingles before autumn storms could sweep in. The steady rhythm of his hammer echoed through the clearing, mingling with bird song and the rustle of aspen leaves. From his perch, he would pause occasionally to watch Ava tend her growing garden, marveling at how naturally she had become part of his world. The attitude in town shifted like weather-worn fence posts slowly straightening. Folks who had once turned away in shame or shouted cruel words now approached the cabin with hesitant steps and gifts tucked under their arms. Mrs. Peterson brought a sack of fine wheat flour and fresh churned butter. The Cooper sisters arrived with carefully folded lengths of calico and muslin. Even old widow Johnston, known for her prized flower garden, shuffled up the path one morning with packets of marigold and zinnia seeds. Ava received each visitor with the same gentle grace, offering coffee and conversation without a trace of bitterness. Her forgiveness seemed to heal something in the visitors themselves, who left with lighter steps and clearer eyes. On Sundays, Samuel found himself drawn back to church services, something he had avoided since his wife's passing. He sat beside Ava in the wooden pew, her presence steady and warm beside him. When she lifted her voice during hymns, he felt his own faith stirring back to life, like spring water breaking through winter ice. One evening, as lamplight cast golden shadows on the cabin walls, Ava began singing a Spanish lullaby her mother had taught her. The melody was soft as falling snow, the words speaking of starlight and mother's love. Samuel listened, then quietly began to hum along. His deep voice blended with hers, rough but tender, like bark against silk. "My mother sang this to me when I was small," Ava explained, her eyes distant with memory. "Now I sing it here, in our home." She paused, then looked directly at Samuel. "I want you to know, I'm staying. Not because I must, but because I choose this place. Choose this family we've made." Samuel's throat tightened. The word family echoed in his heart, filling empty spaces he thought would stay forever hollow. He managed a nod, his weathered hands clasped together. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, voice rough with emotion, "for bringing life back to these walls." Ava's smile in response was bright as morning sun through cabin windows, full of promise and belonging. The first snow of winter drifted down like feathers, dusting the pine trees surrounding Samuel's cabin with delicate white. Inside, golden lamplight spilled across the wooden floors, casting warm shadows on the walls. The hearth crackled merrily as Ava stirred a pot of venison stew, the savory aroma filling every corner. Samuel sat at his workbench near the window, his weathered hands moving with careful precision as he carved a wooden cross. Wood shavings curled at his feet like pale ribbons. The piece had taken shape slowly over several evenings, simple yet beautiful, smooth pine bearing the marks of patient craftsmanship. Rising from his chair, Samuel lifted the finished cross and studied it in the lamplight. Satisfaction gleamed in his eyes as he mounted it carefully above the stone mantel. It seemed to belong there, a symbol of their shared faith and the grace that had brought them together. "Supper's ready," Ava called softly, ladling the steaming stew into tin bowls. They settled at the table, sharing fresh cornbread and the hearty stew. The comfortable silence between them spoke of trust, hard-won, and peace well-earned. Outside, winter wind whistled through the pines, but inside all was warm and sheltered. After the bowls were cleared, Ava reached for the leather-bound Bible on the shelf. The pages rustled as she found her place, her voice clear and steady as she read, "For the Lord has redeemed you." The ancient words of Isaiah filled the cabin with promise. Samuel listened, firelight catching the tears that shone in his eyes. How long had it been since he'd felt such peace? Since his home had held such warmth? The wind rose outside, its lonely howl only emphasizing the sanctuary they'd created within these walls. Ava closed the Bible gently and began to hum. The freedom song she'd learned from her mother, its melody speaking of hope and deliverance. The tune wrapped around them like a blanket. To her surprise and joy, Samuel's deep voice joined hers. Their different tones wove together, her clear soprano and his rough baritone creating something new and beautiful. The harmonies echoed off the cabin walls, filling every corner with music. Samuel leaned back in his chair, watching Ava's face glow in the firelight. Her smile held all the brightness of dawn, all the warmth of summer stored up against the winter cold. The crushing loneliness that had been his companion for so many years lifted like morning mist, replaced by the certainty of belonging. Though the world beyond their clearing remained as wild and unforgiving as ever, here they had built something precious, a home founded on faith, strengthened by trials, and blessed with the miracle of chosen family. Thanks for tuning in. These stories remind us that life is more than headlines. It's about heartlines. Subscribe if you want more moments that make you pause, feel, and reflect.